In the shadowed corridors of Thornfield Manor, where whispered secrets echoed through marble halls, Duke Alexander Whitmore lay motionless in his grand four-poster bed. The physicians had declared his condition grave, a riding accident that left him unconscious for days. Yet behind closed eyelids, Alexander was very much aware, listening to every word spoken in his presence. What he discovered about his beloved fiancée would shatter everything he believed about love, loyalty, and the woman he was meant to marry. The truth, when it came, would be more devastating than any physical wound. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The autumn of 1887 painted the English countryside in shades of amber and crimson, and nowhere was this beauty more evident than at Thornfield Manor, the ancestral seat of the Whitmore family. Duke Alexander Whitmore stood at the tall windows of his study, watching the morning mist rise from the manicured gardens below. At 28, he possessed the refined bearing expected of his station, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the light and intelligent grey eyes that seemed to see through the carefully constructed facades of London society. The weight of his title had never felt heavier than it did this morning. In 3 weeks' time, he would marry Lady Vivian Ashford, daughter of the Earl of Pemberton, in what society deemed the perfect union of two distinguished bloodlines. The engagement had been arranged when they were children, a strategic alliance that would merge vast estates and considerable fortunes. Alexander had grown up believing this was simply the natural order of things, duty before desire, obligation before affection. "Your Grace," came the measured voice of his butler, Hartwell, from the doorway. "Lady Vivian has arrived for breakfast, as scheduled." Alexander straightened his waistcoat and made his way to the morning room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows adorned with heavy velvet drapes. Vivian sat poised at the mahogany table, her golden hair arranged in perfect ringlets beneath a fashionable hat trimmed with peacock feathers. She was undeniably beautiful, porcelain skin, cornflower blue eyes, and a figure that drew admiring glances wherever she went. Yet as Alexander took his seat across from her, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at a carefully painted portrait rather than a living, breathing woman. "Good morning, my dear," Alexander said, settling into his chair as footmen served breakfast from silver chafing dishes. "Alexander," Vivian replied with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I trust you slept well? We have much to discuss regarding the wedding preparations." As she spoke about floral arrangements and guest lists, Alexander found his attention drifting to the window, where he could see his head groom exercising Thunder, his favorite stallion. The horse moved with such freedom, such natural grace, that Alexander felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. When had his own life become so rigidly choreographed? "Are you listening to me, Alexander?" Vivian's voice carried a note of irritation that she quickly masked with another smile. "Of course, my apologies. You were saying about the cathedral." Vivian's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her teacup. "I was discussing the importance of ensuring that the Pemberton family jewels are prominently displayed during the ceremony. After all, this union represents the joining of two of England's most prestigious families. The symbolism must be perfect." Alexander nodded, though something in her tone troubled him. There was a calculating quality to her words, as if she were discussing a business transaction rather than their wedding day. He had always assumed that affection would grow between them over time, as it had for many arranged couples of their acquaintance. Yet after years of courtship, he felt no closer to understanding the woman who would soon bear his name. "Vivian," he said carefully, "I sometimes wonder if we might postpone the ceremony. Perhaps take more time to truly know one another before—" "Postpone." Vivian's cup clattered against its saucer. "Alexander, the invitations have been sent, the arrangements made. My father has already transferred significant holdings in anticipation of our union. Surely you're not suggesting we disappoint both our families over some romantic notion?" The dismissive way she spoke of romance stung more than Alexander cared to admit. "I simply thought you think too much," Vivian interrupted, her smile returning but somehow sharper than before. "We are well suited, Alexander. Our marriage will be advantageous for both families, and that is what matters. Love is a luxury for those without responsibilities." After Vivian departed for London to attend to wedding preparations, Alexander found himself walking the grounds of Thornfield, seeking solace in the familiar paths of his childhood. The estate stretched for miles in every direction. Rolling hills dotted with ancient oaks, formal gardens that had been tended by generations of gardeners, and tenant cottages where families had served the Whitmores for centuries. This land was in his blood, part of his very identity, yet lately it felt more like a beautiful prison. He paused at the family cemetery, where weathered headstones marked the resting places of his ancestors. His parents lay side by side beneath a marble angel, their names carved in elegant script: James Whitmore, 7th Duke of Thornfield, and Lady Catherine Whitmore, beloved wife and mother. Alexander had been only 12 when consumption claimed his mother, and his father had followed her to the grave just 5 years later, leaving Alexander to inherit not just a title and vast wealth, but the crushing weight of expectation. "Duty above all else," his father had told him on his deathbed. "The Whitmore name must be preserved, our legacy protected. You will marry well, Alexander, and you will ensure our bloodline continues." Standing there among the graves of his forebears, Alexander wondered if any of them had ever questioned the path laid out before them. Had his grandfather ever dreamed of a different life? Had his father ever loved his mother, or had theirs too been a marriage of convenience that simply happened to produce an heir? The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Alexander from his melancholy thoughts. His cousin, Lord Edmund Whitmore, cantered up the path on his bay gelding, his usually cheerful face creased with concern. "Alexander, there you are," Edmund called out, dismounting with practiced ease. "I've been looking everywhere for you. There's something we need to discuss." Edmund was 3 years younger than Alexander, the second son of Alexander's uncle, and had always been more brother than cousin. Where Alexander was reserved and dutiful, Edmund possessed an easy charm and infectious laugh that made him popular in London society. He had recently returned from a year abroad, studying art and literature in Paris, and Alexander envied him that freedom. "What troubles you, Edmund?" Alexander asked, noting the unusual gravity in his cousin's demeanor. Edmund glanced around, ensuring they were alone, before speaking in lowered tones. "It's about Lady Vivian. Alexander, I fear there are things about your fiancée that you should know before the wedding." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. "What sort of things?" "I was at Lord Pemberton's estate last week, attending a house party. I overheard a conversation between Vivian and her friend, Lady Charlotte Fairfax. They were discussing your engagement and—" Edmund hesitated, clearly struggling with how to proceed. "Tell me," Alexander demanded, his voice sharper than intended. "Vivian spoke of you with such coldness, Alexander. She referred to the marriage as a necessary sacrifice, and mentioned that once she bears an heir, she intends to live quite independently. There was talk of maintaining a residence in London, separate from Thornfield, and of other arrangements." The words hit Alexander like physical blows. He had suspected that Vivian felt no deep affection for him, but to hear that she viewed their marriage as merely a stepping stone to greater freedom was devastating. "There's more," Edmund continued reluctantly. "She spoke of your fortune with particular interest, mentioning specific investments and properties. It seemed she knew more about your financial affairs than would be proper for a fiancé." Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he had believed about his engagement, about his future, was crumbling. Yet a part of him wondered if Edmund might be mistaken, if perhaps he had misunderstood the conversation. "Are you certain of what you heard?" Alexander asked, though his heart already knew the answer. "I wish I weren't." Edmund replied sadly. "Alexander, you deserve better than a marriage built on deception and greed. There's still time to call off the engagement." But even as Edmund spoke these words, Alexander knew it wasn't that simple. The contracts had been signed, the settlements agreed upon. Both families had invested too much in this union for it to be easily dissolved. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted, and Alexander found himself wondering if there might be a way to discover the truth about Vivian's feelings before it was too late. As the two men walked back toward the manor, Alexander's mind raced with possibilities. He needed to know, with absolute certainty, what kind of woman he was about to marry. But how could he uncover her true nature when she was so skilled at presenting the perfect facade? The answer, when it came to him, was both brilliant and dangerous. What if fate were to intervene? What if circumstances arose that would reveal Vivian's true character, stripping away all pretense and social convention? Alexander's grey eyes gleamed with newfound determination as a plan began to form in his mind. But first, he would need to test the depths of his fiancée's deception. And he suspected that what he discovered might change everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the woman who claimed to want to share his name. What desperate measure would Alexander take to uncover the truth about his fiancée's heart? And would he be prepared for what he might discover in the shadows of Thornfield Manor? The morning of October 15th dawned grey and forbidding, with heavy clouds gathering over Thornfield Manor like an omen of the events to come. Alexander had spent the previous week in careful preparation, confiding his plan only to Edmund and his most trusted servants. Today, he would stage his own accident, a fall from his horse that would leave him apparently unconscious but fully aware of everything happening around him. It was a desperate gamble, but one he felt compelled to take. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, the family physician and Alexander's longtime friend, had been reluctantly brought into the conspiracy. A man of science and discretion, Dr. Blackwood had initially protested the deception, but ultimately agreed when Alexander explained his suspicions about Vivian's true nature. "This is highly irregular, Your Grace," Dr. Blackwood had warned. "If you're discovered, the scandal could destroy you, and if Lady Vivian is innocent of your suspicions, you'll have committed a grave injustice." "Then I pray I am wrong," Alexander had replied. "But I must know the truth before I bind myself to her for life." The plan was set in motion during Alexander's morning ride. He had chosen a secluded path near the old stone bridge that crossed the stream dividing his property, a place where an accident would seem plausible. Edmund waited nearby, ready to discover his cousin's unconscious form and summon help. Thunder, Alexander's stallion, had been trained to rear on command, a trick Alexander had taught him years ago for theatrical purposes that now served a darker need. As Alexander approached the bridge, he gave Thunder the subtle signal. The magnificent horse reared dramatically, and Alexander threw himself from the saddle with practiced skill, landing hard enough to appear genuinely injured while avoiding serious harm. The performance was convincing, so much so that for a moment Alexander wondered if he had miscalculated and actually hurt himself. Edmund's cries for help echoed across the countryside as he discovered Alexander's motionless form. Within minutes, grooms and servants came running, and Dr. Blackwood arrived with his medical bag, playing his part perfectly as he examined the unconscious Duke. "His pulse is weak but steady," Dr. Blackwood announced gravely to the assembled crowd. "We must get him to the manor immediately. Send word to Lady Vivian at once. She must come from London without delay." Alexander was carried to his bedchamber on a makeshift stretcher, his body limp and unresponsive. Dr. Blackwood had prepared a mild sedative that would slow Alexander's breathing and heartbeat, making his condition appear more serious than it was. As Alexander lay in his four-poster bed, surrounded by heavy curtains and flickering candlelight, he steeled himself for what was to come. Vivienne arrived at Thornfield Manor that evening in a flurry of black silk and theatrical grief. Alexander heard her carriage wheels on the gravel drive, followed by the rapid clicking of her heels on the marble floors as she hurried to his bedside. Through barely opened eyelids he watched her approach, noting how she paused to check her appearance in the mirror before entering his chamber. "Oh, my dearest Alexander," Vivian cried, her voice carrying perfectly to the servants gathered in the hallway. "How could this terrible accident have happened?" She knelt beside his bed, taking his limp hand in hers, and Alexander felt the coldness of her touch even through his feigned unconsciousness. Her tears, he noticed, were carefully controlled, enough to appear grief-stricken without ruining her complexion. Dr. Blackwood entered the room, his expression appropriately grave. "Lady Vivian, I'm afraid the Duke's condition is quite serious. He has suffered a severe blow to the head, and while he lives, I cannot say when, or if, he will regain consciousness." "If?" Vivian's voice rose in what sounded like genuine alarm. "Surely you don't mean to suggest that he could?" "I'm afraid we must prepare for all possibilities," Dr. Blackwood replied solemnly. "The next few days will be critical. I recommend that you remain close, in case he should wish to say farewell." Alexander watched through his lashes as Vivian's face went pale. For a moment he almost felt guilty for putting her through such distress. Perhaps Edmund had been wrong about her character. Perhaps she truly did care for him, despite their arranged engagement. "I shall not leave his side," Vivian declared, settling into the chair beside his bed. "Alexander, my darling, you must fight. You must come back to me." For the first day and night, Vivian maintained her vigil with admirable dedication. She held Alexander's hand, spoke to him in gentle tones, and even read aloud from his favorite books. Alexander began to hope that his suspicions had been unfounded, that beneath her cool exterior lay a woman capable of genuine affection. But on the second day, when Dr. Blackwood suggested that Alexander's condition was unlikely to improve, everything changed. Lady Charlotte Fairfax arrived from London, ostensibly to comfort her dear friend in her time of trial. Charlotte was a striking woman with auburn hair and calculating green eyes, known throughout society for her sharp wit and sharper tongue. She was also, Alexander had long suspected, a malicious influence on Vivian. "My poor dear Vivienne," Charlotte cooed as she entered the bedchamber. "How dreadful this must be for you, trapped here in this gloomy place while your fiancé lingers between life and death." "It is my duty to be here," Vivienne replied, though Alexander detected a note of weariness in her voice that hadn't been there before. "Duty? Yes," Charlotte agreed, settling into a chair near the window. "But one must also be practical about these matters. Tell me, what does this mean for your future? Surely there are arrangements to be considered." Alexander felt his blood chill at Charlotte's words. Through his barely opened eyes he saw Vivian glance toward the door, ensuring they were alone before responding. "The physicians say he may never wake," Vivian said quietly, "and if he does, there's no guarantee he'll be the same man. Brain injuries can be unpredictable." "How tragic," Charlotte murmured, though her tone suggested anything but tragedy. "Of course, if the worst should happen, you would be free to marry elsewhere. The Pemberton family would hardly expect you to remain bound to a dead man's memory." "Charlotte, please," Vivian protested, but weakly. "It's too soon to speak of such things." "Is it?" Charlotte pressed. "My dear, you're 24 years old, in the prime of your beauty. Would you truly waste your youth mourning a man who may already be lost to you? Think of the opportunities that might present themselves. Lord Harrington has been quite attentive lately, and his fortune rivals even the Duke's." Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs as he listened to this callous conversation. Surely Vivian would rebuke her friend, would defend their engagement even in the face of uncertainty. Instead, Vivian was quiet for a long moment before speaking in a voice so low Alexander had to strain to hear her words. "I confess, Charlotte, that I have wondered what my life might have been if I had been free to choose my own path. This engagement was arranged when I was barely out of the schoolroom. I've never known what it might be like to marry for affection rather than obligation. And now you may have that chance, Charlotte said eagerly. If Alexander doesn't recover, you'll be free to follow your heart. Surely that's worth considering. I suppose it is, Vivienne admitted, and Alexander felt as though she had driven a dagger through his chest. Though I confess, I feel guilty for even thinking such thoughts while he lies here so helpless. Guilt is a luxury you cannot afford, Charlotte declared. You must think of your future, your happiness. If fate has intervened to free you from this arrangement, perhaps you should view it as a blessing rather than a tragedy. The conversation continued in this vein for nearly an hour, with Charlotte systematically dismantling any loyalty Vivienne might have felt toward Alexander. She spoke of other potential suitors, of the freedom that widowhood, or its equivalent, might bring, of the opportunities that awaited a beautiful, wealthy young woman unencumbered by an inconvenient husband. And Vivienne listened, occasionally protesting, but never with real conviction. Worse still, as the days passed and Alexander maintained his deception, he heard her speak more freely about her true feelings. On the third night, when she believed herself alone with his unconscious form, Vivienne finally revealed the depths of her deception. "Oh, Alexander," she whispered, her voice carrying none of the warmth she displayed for others. "If only you knew how I've dreaded our wedding day. How I've prayed for some escape from this gilded cage your family has built around me." Alexander's blood turned to ice as he listened to her confession. "I never wanted this life, this responsibility. I wanted to travel, to see the world, to marry for love rather than duty. But my father made it clear that I had no choice in the matter. The Pemberton debts are greater than anyone knows, and your fortune is the only thing that can save us from ruin." She paused, and Alexander heard the rustle of silk as she moved closer to his bedside. "If you die, I'll be free," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Free to live as I choose, with enough of your money to ensure I never have to marry for convenience again. Is that terrible of me? Perhaps it is, but I cannot pretend to mourn a future I never wanted." The words hit Alexander like physical blows. Everything he had suspected was true, and worse than he had imagined. Vivienne didn't just feel no affection for him. She actively wished for his death as a means of escape from their engagement. But her confession wasn't finished. "Charlotte is right about Lord Harrington," Vivienne continued. "He's handsome, charming, and his estate in Scotland would be the perfect place to start fresh. Far from the memories of this place, far from the expectations of being a duchess. I could be simply Lady Harrington, free to live as I please." Alexander heard her rise from her chair and move toward the window, where moonlight streamed through the heavy curtains. "I should feel guilty for these thoughts," she mused, "but I find that I don't. You've never truly seen me, Alexander. To you, I'm simply the appropriate wife, the suitable duchess. You've never asked what I might want, what I might dream of. In your way, you're as much a prison as this engagement." The cruelty of her words was breathtaking. Alexander had always tried to be considerate, to treat Vivienne with respect and kindness. That she viewed his efforts as imprisonment revealed a selfishness he had never suspected. "If you recover," Vivienne said, returning to his bedside, "I suppose I'll have to go through with the wedding, but if you don't—" She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Over the following days, Alexander endured a parade of visitors, each conversation revealing new depths of deception and callousness. He learned that Vivienne had been corresponding with Lord Harrington for months, that she had already made inquiries about breaking their engagement, and that she had discussed with her father the possibility of claiming a portion of Alexander's estate, even if their marriage never took place. Most devastating of all was the conversation he overheard between Vivienne and her lady's maid, a woman named Sarah, who had served the Ashford family for years. "Miss Vivienne," Sarah said as she helped her mistress prepare for bed, "I can't help but notice that you seem different since the Duke's accident. Almost relieved, if I may say so." "Relieved?" Vivienne laughed, a sound devoid of humour. Sarah, I feel as though I can breathe freely for the first time in years. If Alexander dies, I'll inherit enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. If he lives but remains diminished, I can claim that I cannot marry a man who is not whole in mind and body. Either way, I escape this trap. But miss, Sarah protested, surely you feel some affection for his grace? He's always been kind to you. Kind, yes, Vivian agreed. But kindness is not love, Sarah, and I refuse to spend my life grateful for mere kindness when I could have passion, adventure, freedom. Alexander represents everything I despise about this life: duty, obligation, the sacrifice of personal happiness for family honor. What if he recovers completely? Sarah asked. What then? Vivian was quiet for a long moment before answering. Then I suppose I'll have to find another way to free myself. Perhaps a scandal that would make me unsuitable as a duchess. Or perhaps— She paused, and Alexander heard the dangerous calculation in her voice. Perhaps accidents can happen more than once. The implication of her words sent a chill through Alexander's very soul. Was she actually contemplating harm to him? The woman he had planned to marry, to trust with his life and his legacy, was revealing herself to be not just indifferent to his welfare, but potentially dangerous. As the week progressed, Alexander's deception became increasingly difficult to maintain. The physical strain of remaining motionless for hours at a time was considerable, but the emotional toll was far worse. Every conversation he overheard stripped away another layer of illusion, revealing the true nature of the woman he had nearly bound himself to for life. On the 7th day of his supposed unconsciousness, Dr. Blackwood announced that Alexander's condition appeared to be stabilizing, though his recovery remained uncertain. The news prompted Vivian to send urgent messages to London, and Alexander soon understood why when Lord Harrington himself arrived at Thornfield Manor. James Harrington was everything Alexander was not: golden-haired, gregarious, and possessed of an easy charm that made him popular in society. He was also, Alexander now realized, the man Vivian truly desired to marry. "My dear Lady Vivienne," Harrington said as he entered Alexander's bedchamber, his voice carrying clearly to where Alexander lay. "I came as soon as I received your message. How dreadful this must be for you." "James," Vivienne breathed, and Alexander heard in that single word more warmth than she had ever shown him. "I'm so grateful you're here. I feel so alone, so frightened." "You needn't be frightened any longer," Harrington replied, and Alexander heard the sound of movement, as if the man had taken Vivian in his arms. "Whatever happens, you won't face it alone." "But what if he recovers?" Vivian whispered. "What if I'm trapped in this engagement forever?" "Then we'll find a way to free you," Harrington assured her. "There are always ways, my darling. Always." The endearment hit Alexander like a physical blow. Here, in his own bedchamber, while he lay supposedly dying, his fiancée was making plans with another man. The betrayal was complete, absolute, and devastating, but it was also liberating. For the first time since his accident, Alexander felt a sense of clarity. He knew exactly what he had to do, and exactly how he would do it. Vivian wanted her freedom. He would give it to her, but not in the way she expected. As night fell over Thornfield Manor, Alexander began to plan his resurrection. And when he rose from his supposed deathbed, he would ensure that everyone, especially Lady Vivian Ashford, learned the true cost of deception and betrayal. But first, he needed to hear one more conversation, one final confirmation of everything he had discovered, and he suspected that tomorrow would bring exactly the revelation he needed to justify what he was about to do. What final betrayal would Vivian reveal that would seal her fate forever? And how would Alexander use the truth he had discovered to turn the tables on the woman who had wished for his death? The 8th morning of Alexander's deception dawned, with an unexpected visitor that would change everything. Lady Margaret Whitmore, Alexander's formidable aunt and the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshollow, arrived at Thornfield Manor in her imposing black carriage, her silver hair gleaming beneath a fashionable hat adorned with jet beads. At 62, Lady Margaret possessed a sharp intellect and an even sharper tongue, having navigated the treacherous waters of London society for over 4 decades. She had never married after her husband's death in the Crimean War, choosing instead to dedicate herself to charitable works and the education of young women. Alexander heard her arrival from his bedchamber, the authoritative click of her walking stick on marble floors, the respectful murmurs of servants, and finally her commanding voice as she demanded to see that gel who claims to be grieving for my nephew. Lady Margaret. Vivian's voice carried a note of nervousness as she greeted the Dowager Duchess. How kind of you to come. Alexander would be so pleased to know you're here. Would he indeed? Lady Margaret's tone was arctic. How presumptuous of you to speak for a man who cannot speak for himself. I've come to see the state of affairs for myself, and I must say, what I've observed thus far is most illuminating. Through his barely opened eyes, Alexander watched his aunt enter his bedchamber with the bearing of a queen surveying her domain. She was a striking woman still, tall and elegant, with the same grey eyes that marked the Whitmore bloodline. Her gaze swept over Vivian with obvious disapproval before settling on Alexander's still form. "Leave us," Lady Margaret commanded, her voice brooking no argument. "I wish to speak with my nephew alone." "But Lady Margaret," Vivian protested, "the physicians say he cannot hear." "I said leave us." The Dowager Duchess's voice could have frozen the Thames in July. "And close the door behind you." Once they were alone, Lady Margaret approached Alexander's bedside with surprising gentleness. She pulled a chair close and sat down, her sharp eyes studying his face intently. "Alexander, my dear boy," she said quietly, "if you can hear me, I want you to know that I've been watching and I've seen quite enough. That creature you're engaged to has revealed her true nature most thoroughly. Blink once, if you understand me." Alexander's heart raced. Had his aunt somehow discovered his deception? Carefully, he allowed his eyelid to flutter once, so subtly that it might have been mistaken for an involuntary muscle spasm. Lady Margaret leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I thought as much. You always were too clever for your own good, just like your father. I don't know what game you're playing, but I suspect Lady Vivian is about to reveal something that will justify whatever scheme you've concocted." Before Alexander could process this revelation fully, voices in the hallway announced the return of Vivian and her companions. Lady Margaret straightened in her chair, her expression returning to its mask of aristocratic composure. "Lady Margaret," Vivian said, as she re-entered with Charlotte and Lord Harrington in tow, "may I present Lord Harrington? He's been such a comfort during this difficult time." "I'm sure he has," Lady Margaret replied dryly, her gaze taking in Harrington's too familiar proximity to Vivian. How convenient that he should arrive so promptly after the accident. "James has been a dear friend to both Alexander and myself," Vivian said, though her colour rose slightly. "His presence has been most proper, I assure you." "Proper," Lady Margaret repeated, as if tasting something unpleasant. "Yes, I can see how proper everything has been. Tell me, Lady Vivian, what are your plans should my nephew not recover from his injuries?" The directness of the question clearly caught Vivian off guard. She glanced at Charlotte, who stepped forward with her usual calculating smile. "Lady Margaret, surely such morbid speculation is premature," Charlotte interjected. "We must maintain hope for His Grace's recovery." "Must we?" Lady Margaret's eyebrows rose. "How refreshing to hear such optimism from someone who, according to my sources, has been discussing alternative arrangements with remarkable enthusiasm." Alexander watched the colour drain from Charlotte's face, while Vivian's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the back of a chair. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Vivian said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Don't you?" Lady Margaret stood, her full height making her an imposing figure in the candlelit room. Perhaps you'd care to explain the correspondence my London solicitor intercepted. Letters between your father and certain financial institutions regarding the early release of settlement funds, or the inquiries made about the legal implications of an engagement dissolved due to incapacity. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander felt a surge of gratitude toward his aunt, whose network of informants throughout London society was legendary. She had clearly been conducting her own investigation into Vivian's character. Lady Margaret, Lord Harrington stepped forward, his charm noticeably strained. Surely you cannot blame Lady Vivian for seeking to understand her legal position during such an uncertain time. Can I not? Lady Margaret turned her steely gaze on him. And what, pray tell, is your interest in Lady Vivian's legal position, Lord Harrington? Last I heard, you were courting the Pemberton heiress, not comforting her in her supposed grief. I am here as a friend, Harrington replied stiffly. Nothing more. A friend who arrives within hours of being summoned, who takes such intimate liberties as to hold the lady's hand in public, and who has been seen entering her private chambers at most unseemly hours. Lady Margaret's voice cut like a blade. Your definition of friendship is most expansive. Alexander watched Vivian's composure crumble as his aunt systematically dismantled her carefully constructed facade. The woman he had thought he would marry was being revealed as not just mercenary, but actively duplicitous. I think, Lady Margaret continued, that it would be best if you all departed Thornfield immediately. The Duke requires peace and quiet for his recovery, not the distraction of visitors with questionable motives. You cannot simply dismiss us, Charlotte protested. Vivienne is Alexander's fiancée. She has every right to be here. Does she? Lady Margaret smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I wonder what the Duke would say about that, were he able to speak. I suspect his views on the engagement might have evolved, given recent revelations about his bride-to-be's character. How dare you? Vivian finally found her voice, anger overriding her usual calculated composure. You know nothing of my feelings for Alexander, nothing of what I've sacrificed for this engagement. Sacrificed? Lady Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. My dear girl, the only sacrifice you've made is pretending to care for a man whose death you've been anticipating with barely concealed glee. Did you truly think your conversations went unheard? That your plans with Lord Harrington were secret? The accusation hung in the air like a sword. Alexander watched Vivian's face cycle through shock, fear, and finally a cold fury that revealed her true nature more clearly than any words could have. Even if that were true, Vivian said, her voice low and dangerous, what could you possibly do about it? Alexander is unconscious, possibly dying. I am still his legal fiancée, and I will inherit according to the terms of our engagement contract. Will you indeed? Lady Margaret's smile widened. How fascinating that you should mention the contract. You see, my dear, there are certain clauses that you may not have considered, provisions that become void under specific circumstances. What circumstances? Charlotte demanded, stepping protectively closer to Vivian. Infidelity, for one, Lady Margaret replied calmly. The contract specifically states that should either party engage in improper conduct with another person, the engagement may be dissolved without penalty. I believe entertaining a lover in one's fiancé's own home while he lies dying would qualify as improper conduct, don't you? Alexander felt a surge of admiration for his aunt's strategic brilliance. She was systematically destroying Vivian's position, using the very contract that was meant to bind him to expose her betrayal. You have no proof of any impropriety, Harrington said, but his voice lacked confidence. Don't I? Lady Margaret moved to the window and gestured outside. My carriage driver has excellent eyesight, and he's been most observant during his stay here. Shall I detail what he's witnessed? Or perhaps we should discuss the testimony of certain servants who've been troubled by what they've observed. Alexander realized that his aunt had been conducting a thorough investigation, gathering evidence of Vivienne's betrayal. The net was closing around his false fiancée, and she was beginning to understand the precariousness of her position. "This is preposterous," Vivienne declared, but her voice shook. "Even if you could prove such ridiculous allegations, Alexander is in no condition to dissolve our engagement. The contract remains valid." "Ah," Lady Margaret said softly, "but that assumes Alexander remains incapacitated. What if he were to recover? What if he were to learn of your activities during his illness? Do you truly believe he would honor an engagement to a woman who wished for his death?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander watched Vivienne's face as the implications sank in. If he recovered, she would face not just the loss of her inheritance, but public scandal and social ruin. "He won't recover," Vivienne said suddenly, her mask finally slipping completely. "The physicians have said so. His injuries are too severe." "Have they?" Lady Margaret's eyebrows rose. "How interesting that you should sound so certain, almost as if you have some knowledge the rest of us lack." "I know nothing beyond what the doctors have told us all," Vivienne replied, but her protest sounded hollow. "Then you won't mind if I bring in a specialist from London," Lady Margaret announced. "Dr. Pemberton, no relation to your family, I assure you, is renowned for his work with head injuries. If Alexander's condition is truly hopeless, he'll confirm it. If not—" "No," Vivienne said quickly, then caught herself. "That is, surely such measures are unnecessary. Dr. Blackwood is perfectly competent." "Is he?" Lady Margaret's smile was predatory. "Then you won't object to a second opinion, unless, of course, you have some reason to fear what another physician might discover." Alexander watched the trap close around Vivienne with grim satisfaction. His aunt had maneuvered her into a position where any objection would seem suspicious, while any agreement might lead to the discovery of his deception. "I think," Lord Harrington said suddenly, "that perhaps we should return to London. Lady Vivienne needs time to process her grief without these accusations." "An excellent suggestion," Lady Margaret agreed. "I'm sure Lady Vivienne would benefit from some distance from Thornfield, perhaps a great deal of distance." "I will not be driven from my fiancé's side by your insinuations," Vivienne declared, but her resolve was clearly wavering. "Then perhaps," Lady Margaret said quietly, "you should consider what will happen when Alexander awakens." "Because he will awaken, my dear, and when he does, he'll want to know exactly what transpired during his illness. Every conversation, every visitor, every indiscretion." The threat was clear, and Alexander saw its impact on Vivienne's face. She was beginning to understand that her position was far more precarious than she had realized. "Come, Vivienne," Charlotte said urgently. "We should return to London immediately. You need proper rest, proper care. This place is too oppressive for someone in your delicate condition." "Yes," Harrington agreed quickly. "The London air will do you good, and there are arrangements to be made, regardless of the Duke's condition." Alexander felt a cold fury at Harrington's words. Even now, faced with exposure, the man was encouraging Vivienne to abandon her supposed fiancé for her own convenience. "Very well," Vivienne said finally, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "I shall return to London, but I want it understood that I'm leaving under protest and that I maintain my position as Alexander's fiancé." "Of course you do," Lady Margaret replied smoothly. "I'm sure that position will be thoroughly examined in due course." As the three conspirators prepared to depart, Alexander heard Vivienne approach his bedside one final time. She leaned close, and he felt her breath against his ear as she whispered words that chilled him to the bone. "If you can hear me, Alexander, know this. I will not be cast aside so easily. I have invested too much in this engagement to lose it now. If you recover, you'll find that I can be a very dangerous enemy." The threat was unmistakable, and Alexander realized that his deception had revealed not just Vivienne's greed and infidelity, but something far more sinister. The woman he had nearly married was capable of genuine malice, and she had just declared war on him. After their departure, Lady Margaret remained in the room, her sharp eyes fixed on Alexander's supposedly unconscious form. "Well played, my dear nephew," she said quietly, "though I suspect this is far from over. That creature will not give up her claim to the Whitmore fortune without a fight. You'll need to be very careful when you make your miraculous recovery." Alexander allowed his eyes to open fully, meeting his aunt's knowing gaze. "How long have you known?" "From the moment I walked into this room," Lady Margaret replied with a slight smile. "You always were a terrible actor, even as a child. Besides, no man unconscious for over a week maintains such perfect muscle tone. You've been exercising when no one was watching." Alexander sat up slowly, working the stiffness from his limbs. "What gave me away?" "Your breathing pattern changed whenever Vivian spoke," his aunt explained. "Subtle, but noticeable to someone who knows you well. Also, Dr. Blackwood's reports were suspiciously vague. I suspected he was complicit in whatever scheme you'd devised." "And you approve of my deception?" Lady Margaret's expression grew serious. "Alexander, what I witnessed here would have horrified me, even if I hadn't known you were conscious. That woman is not just unsuitable as a wife. She's dangerous. Her willingness to wish for your death, her casual betrayal with Harrington, her threats just now, you've had a narrow escape. But the scandal," Alexander said, "when the truth comes out, will be manageable," his aunt interrupted. "We'll say you suffered from temporary amnesia, that you're only now beginning to remember recent events. The important thing is that you've learned Vivian's true nature before it was too late." Alexander nodded, though he felt the weight of what lay ahead. Breaking the engagement would create a sensation in London society, and the Pemberton family would not accept the loss of the Whitmore fortune quietly. "There's something else," Lady Margaret said, her tone becoming more gentle. "While you've been playing dead, I've been making inquiries about suitable companions for your recovery. There's a young woman I'd like you to meet, Miss Eleanor Hartwell, Dr. Blackwood's niece. She's been working with wounded soldiers, helping them recover from traumatic injuries. She's intelligent, compassionate, and utterly without artifice." "Aunt Margaret," Alexander began, but she held up a hand. "I'm not suggesting another arranged marriage," she said firmly. "I'm suggesting that you might benefit from the company of someone genuine while you recover from this ordeal. Someone who sees people as they truly are, not as society expects them to be." Alexander considered this as he prepared to face the world again. The thought of meeting someone without pretense, someone who valued honesty over social advantage, was appealing after what he had endured. "When will she arrive?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Lady Margaret replied with satisfaction. "I took the liberty of sending for her before I confronted your former fiancée. I had a feeling you might need authentic companionship once this charade ended." As Alexander prepared for his recovery, he reflected on the lessons of the past week. He had learned that the woman he thought he would marry was capable of wishing for his death, that his position and wealth made him a target for those who would use him, and that sometimes the most painful truths were also the most liberating. But he had also learned that he had allies. His aunt's fierce loyalty, Dr. Blackwood's friendship, Edmund's concern, and perhaps, if Lady Margaret was right, he might soon discover what it meant to know someone who valued him for himself rather than his title. The game was far from over, but for the first time since his supposed accident, Alexander felt hope stirring in his chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring the possibility of something he had never dared to dream of, a connection based on truth rather than obligation. What would this mysterious Miss Hartwell reveal about the possibility of genuine affection? And how would Alexander navigate the treacherous waters of breaking his engagement while protecting himself from Vivian's promised revenge? The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Thornfield Manor as Miss Eleanor Hartwell's modest carriage approached the estate. Alexander watched from his study window, having abandoned his sickbed charade the previous evening after Lady Margaret's departure. He felt a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. After the devastating revelations about Vivian's character, he found himself questioning his ability to judge anyone's true nature. Eleanor Hartwell stepped from the carriage with the practical grace of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way society demanded. Her auburn hair was simply arranged, her traveling dress was well made but not fashionable, and her face bore the intelligent, determined expression of a woman who had seen real hardship. Yet there was something immediately compelling about her, a quiet strength that drew Alexander's attention even from a distance. Dr. Blackwood emerged from the manor to greet his niece, and Alexander could see the genuine affection between them. Eleanor embraced her uncle warmly, then immediately began directing the unloading of several trunks and what appeared to be medical supplies. "She's brought her entire field hospital," Dr. Blackwood explained when he found Alexander in the study an hour later. "Eleanor doesn't do anything by halves. When I told her about your condition, she insisted on bringing everything she might need for your recovery." "And what exactly have you told her about my condition?" Alexander asked carefully. Dr. Blackwood's expression grew serious. "The truth, I'm afraid. Eleanor has worked with too many genuinely injured men to be fooled by deception. She would have seen through your charade immediately, and I couldn't risk her inadvertently exposing you before you were ready." Alexander felt a moment of panic. "She knows everything? She knows you staged your accident to discover your fiancé's true character," Dr. Blackwood confirmed. "What she doesn't know is what you discovered, or what you plan to do about it. I thought it best to let you tell her that yourself." Before Alexander could respond, there was a soft knock at the study door. Eleanor Hartwell entered without waiting for permission, carrying a leather medical bag and wearing an expression of professional assessment. "Your Grace," she said, offering a brief curtsy that seemed more perfunctory than deferential. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell. Uncle Harrison has explained your unique situation. I'm here to help with your recovery, though I suspect the injuries I'll be treating are more emotional than physical." Her directness was startling after years of navigating the careful indirections of society conversation. Alexander found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her dark brown eyes and the slight lines around them that spoke of someone who had seen both suffering and healing. "Miss Hartwell," he replied, gesturing to a chair near the fireplace, "please sit. I confess I'm not entirely sure what your uncle has told you, or what you think of my methods." Eleanor settled into the chair with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to making herself comfortable in unfamiliar surroundings. "He told me you suspected your fiancée of mercenary motives and staged an accident to test her character. I think it was a dangerous gamble that could have destroyed your reputation, but I also think it took considerable courage to risk everything for the truth." Her assessment was delivered without judgment, as if she were discussing a medical procedure rather than a social scandal. Alexander found her matter-of-fact approach both refreshing and slightly unnerving. "And what do you think of a man who would deceive everyone around him, including his own fiancée?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious about her opinion. Eleanor considered this for a moment, her gaze steady on his face. "I think," she said finally, "that a man who goes to such lengths to understand someone's character probably has good reason to doubt it. I've seen enough of human nature to know that people reveal their true selves when they believe no one is watching." "What did you discover?" The simple question opened a floodgate of emotion that Alexander had been suppressing for days. He found himself telling Eleanor everything: Vivian's cold calculations about his death, her affair with Harrington, her threats when she departed. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. "I see," she said when he finished. "So, You're dealing with not just betrayal, but potential danger. Lady Vivian sounds like someone who doesn't accept defeat gracefully. My aunt believes she'll fight the dissolution of our engagement, Alexander confirmed. The financial stakes are considerable for her family. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Then you'll need to be very careful about how you handle your recovery. If she suspects you were conscious during her visits, she could claim you deliberately entrapped her. The scandal could destroy you both. I've been considering that, Alexander admitted. I plan to claim temporary amnesia, that I'm only now beginning to remember recent events. It would explain my recovery while protecting me from accusations of deliberate deception. Clever, Eleanor approved, but you'll need to be consistent in your story, and you'll need witnesses to your gradual recovery, people who can testify to your confusion and slow return of memory. Alexander was struck by her practical approach to what was essentially a massive deception. You're remarkably calm about helping me perpetuate a lie. Eleanor's expression grew more serious. Your Grace, I've worked in military hospitals where men's lives depended on quick thinking and sometimes creative interpretations of regulations. I've learned that absolute honesty is a luxury that not everyone can afford. What matters is protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. And you believe I'm innocent in this? I believe you're a man who discovered that the woman he was meant to marry wished for his death, Eleanor replied firmly. That gives you the right to protect yourself by whatever means necessary. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Edmund, who burst into the study with obvious excitement. Alexander, thank God you're awake. I've just received the most extraordinary news from London. He stopped short when he noticed Eleanor offering her a polite bow. I beg your pardon, I didn't realize you had a visitor. Edmund, this is Miss Eleanor Hartwell, Dr. Blackwood's niece. She's here to assist with my recovery. Eleanor, my cousin, Lord Edmund Whitmore. Edmund's greeting was warm but distracted. Miss Hartwell, a pleasure. Alexander, you need to hear this immediately. It's about Vivian and Harrington. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. What about them? They've been seen together publicly in London, Edmund reported, his eyes bright with excitement. At the opera, at Lady Pemberton's soiree, even riding together in Hyde Park. They're making no effort to hide their association. Eleanor leaned forward with interest. How long has it been since they left here? 3 days, Alexander replied. Surely they wouldn't be so careless so quickly. Unless, Eleanor said thoughtfully, they believe you're still unconscious, and therefore no threat to them. They may think they have time to establish their relationship before you recover. Edmund nodded eagerly. That's exactly what I thought. But there's more. I have it on good authority that Harrington has been making inquiries about the legal implications of inheriting through a deceased fiancée's estate. Deceased? Alexander's voice was sharp. I'm supposed to be unconscious, not dead. Apparently, Edmund continued, he's been asking very specific questions about what would happen if you were to succumb to your injuries. The timing suggests he and Vivian are planning for that eventuality. Eleanor's expression had grown cold. Or perhaps they're planning to help that eventuality along. The suggestion hung in the air like a physical presence. Alexander felt a chill as he considered the implications. Surely they wouldn't dare. Wouldn't they? Eleanor challenged. You've described a woman who openly wished for your death, who threatened you when she left. If she believes you're helpless and she stands to inherit a fortune, we need to accelerate your recovery, Edmund said urgently. If they're planning something, we can't give them the opportunity. Alexander stood and began pacing the room, his mind racing through possibilities. If I recover too quickly, it will seem suspicious. But if I wait too long, there's another consideration, Eleanor added quietly. If Lady Vivian is planning to harm you, she'll need access to you. She'll have to return to Thornfield, probably with some plausible excuse. As if summoned by her words, Hartwell appeared in the doorway with a silver tray. Your Grace, a message has arrived from London, from Lady Vivian. Alexander took the letter with steady hands, though his heart was racing. He broke the seal and read aloud, My dearest Alexander, I have been in London consulting with specialists about your condition. Dr. Pemberton has suggested a new treatment that might aid your recovery, but it must be administered here at Thornfield. I am returning tomorrow with the necessary medicines and equipment. I pray this will be the answer to our prayers. Your devoted fiancée, Vivienne. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Pemberton? Eleanor asked sharply. Uncle Harrison, do you know this physician? Dr. Blackwood, who had entered during the reading of the letter, shook his head grimly. There is no Dr. Pemberton practicing in London, at least none specializing in head injuries. Then whatever she's bringing, Edmund said slowly, it's not medicine. Alexander felt the walls closing in around him. Vivienne was returning, armed with some unknown substance or device, claiming medical authority that didn't exist. The implications were terrifying. We need to be ready for her, Eleanor said, her voice taking on the crisp authority of someone accustomed to crisis situations. Your Grace, you'll need to appear to be recovering gradually, not too quickly to arouse suspicion, but not so slowly that she has time to implement whatever plan she's devised. What do you suggest? Alexander asked, grateful for her practical approach. We stage your awakening for tomorrow morning, just before she arrives, Eleanor explained. You'll be confused, disoriented, with only fragmentary memories. Dr. Blackwood can testify to your gradual improvement over the past day. When Lady Vivienne arrives with her treatment, you'll be conscious enough to refuse it. But what if she insists? Edmund asked. What if she claims medical necessity? Eleanor's smile was sharp. Then we'll have Dr. Blackwood examine whatever she's brought. If it's harmless, no damage done. If it's not, she let the implication hang. You're suggesting we trap her, Alexander realized. I'm suggesting we protect you, Eleanor corrected. If Lady Vivienne is planning to harm you, she needs to be stopped. If she's innocent of such intentions, then no harm will come to her. Alexander looked around the room at the faces of the people who had rallied to protect him. His loyal cousin, his trusted family physician, his formidable aunt, and now this remarkable woman who had walked into his life at exactly the moment he needed her strength and clarity. Very well, he decided. We'll proceed with your plan, but I want everyone to be very careful. If Vivienne is truly dangerous, I won't have any of you put at risk for my sake. With respect, Your Grace, Eleanor said firmly, that's not your decision to make. We're all adults, and we're all choosing to help you. The question is whether you're brave enough to see this through to the end. Her challenge sparked something in Alexander that had been dormant for too long, a sense of his own agency, his own power to shape his destiny, rather than simply accepting what others planned for him. Miss Hartwell, he said with the first genuine smile he had felt in weeks, I believe you may be exactly what I need to face whatever tomorrow brings. As the group began planning the details of Alexander's recovery, none of them noticed the figure watching from the gardens outside the study window. Vivienne had arrived earlier than announced, and she had heard enough to understand that her carefully laid plans were in jeopardy. The game was about to become far more dangerous than any of them realized. What deadly scheme had Vivienne devised for Alexander's treatment? And would Eleanor's quick thinking be enough to save him from the woman who had already proven she would stop at nothing to claim the Whitmore fortune? The pre-dawn hours at Thornfield Manor were shrouded in an unnatural stillness, as if the very estate held its breath in anticipation of the confrontation to come. Alexander had spent a restless night in his study, unable to return to the bedchamber where he had maintained his deception for so long. Eleanor had remained nearby, her medical bag at the ready, while Edmund and Dr. Blackwood took turns keeping watch from different vantage points around the manor. At precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, as planned, Alexander made his way back to his bedchamber with Eleanor's assistance. She had coached him extensively on the symptoms of someone emerging from a prolonged unconscious state. The confusion, the disorientation, the fragmented memories that would come and go like pieces of a shattered mirror. Remember, Eleanor whispered, as she helped him settle into bed. "You're not performing complete amnesia. You're a man whose mind is slowly clearing, like fog lifting from a landscape. Some memories will be sharp, others hazy, and some completely absent." Alexander nodded, then allowed his eyes to flutter closed as Dr. Blackwood entered the room to begin the charade. The physician's examination was thorough and genuine, checking Alexander's pulse, his reflexes, the dilation of his pupils in response to candlelight. "Remarkable," Dr. Blackwood murmured, loud enough for the servants who had been summoned to witness this moment. "His vital signs are much stronger this morning. Alexander! Alexander, can you hear me?" Alexander allowed his eyelids to flutter, then slowly opened his eyes, blinking against the morning light streaming through the windows. He let confusion cloud his features as he looked around the room, his gaze settling on Dr. Blackwood's familiar face. "Harrison." His voice was deliberately hoarse, uncertain. "What? Where am I?" "You're at Thornfield, Alexander," Dr. Blackwood replied gently. "You've been unconscious for over a week. You had an accident while riding." Alexander's hand moved slowly to his head, wincing as if in pain. I remember thunder rearing, but then—" He trailed off, his expression genuinely troubled as he tried to piece together the fragments of his supposed memory. Eleanor stepped forward, her manner professional but kind. "Your Grace, I'm Miss Hartwell, Dr. Blackwood's niece. I've been assisting with your care. It's perfectly normal for your memory to be unclear after such an injury. The important thing is that you're awake and responsive." "Miss Hartwell," Alexander repeated slowly, as if testing the name, his eyes focused on her face with growing clarity. You seem familiar. Have we met before?" "We spoke briefly yesterday evening," Eleanor replied smoothly. "You were drifting in and out of consciousness. You may not remember." The performance was flawless, and Alexander could see the relief and excitement on the faces of the servants who had gathered to witness his awakening. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, was openly weeping with joy, while Hartwell, the butler, maintained his composure but couldn't hide the satisfaction in his eyes. "Your Grace," Hartwell said formally, "shall I send word to Lady Vivian? She will be overjoyed to learn of your recovery." Alexander allowed confusion to cross his features again. "Vivian? Was she here? I have such strange fragments of memory, voices, but I can't place them." "She's been at your bedside constantly," Dr. Blackwood explained, playing his part perfectly. "She only returned to London yesterday to consult with specialists about your condition. She should be arriving this morning, in fact." "This morning?" Alexander struggled to sit up, Eleanor quickly moving to assist him. "I feel as though I should remember more. There are voices in my head, conversations, but they seem like dreams." "That's entirely normal," Eleanor assured him. "Your memory will return gradually. Don't try to force it." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced an arrival. Through the window, Alexander could see Vivienne's familiar coach, but this time it was accompanied by a second vehicle, a plain black carriage that looked distinctly medical in nature. "That will be Lady Vivian," Dr. D. Blackwood announced, "and it appears she's brought the specialist she mentioned." Eleanor and Alexander exchanged a quick glance. The moment of truth was approaching, and they would soon discover exactly what Vivian had planned for her supposedly unconscious fiancé. Within minutes, Vivienne swept into the bedchamber, her performance of joy and relief so convincing that Alexander almost doubted his own memories of her betrayal. She was dressed in deep blue silk that complemented her golden hair, and her eyes sparkled with what appeared to be genuine tears of happiness. "Alexander!" she cried, rushing to his bedside and taking his hands in hers. "Oh, my darling, I knew you would come back to me. I never lost faith, never stopped believing." Alexander allowed himself to appear overwhelmed by her emotion, his confusion evident as he looked into her face. "Vivienne, yes, I remember you, but everything is so unclear. I feel as though I've been dreaming for a very long time." "You have been, my love," Vivian said, her voice thick with apparent emotion. "But you're awake now, and I'm here to take care of you. I've brought Dr. Pemberton from London. He's a specialist in cases like yours. He has a treatment that will help restore your memory completely." Behind Vivian, a tall, thin man in dark clothing entered the room. He carried himself with the authority of a physician, but something about his manner struck Alexander as wrong. His eyes were too calculating, his smile too practiced, and when he spoke, his accent carried traces of something foreign that he was clearly trying to suppress. "Your Grace," the man said with a slight bow, "I am Dr. Pemberton. Lady Vivian has described your case to me in detail, and I believe I can help you make a complete recovery." Eleanor stepped forward, her manner politely professional. "Dr. Pemberton, I'm Miss Hartwell. I've been assisting Dr. Blackwood with his Grace's care. Might I ask about your credentials? I'm not familiar with your work in London." The false doctor's eyes flickered with annoyance at the challenge. "I maintain a private practice, Miss Hartwell, was it? I specialize in cases that require discretion. Lady Vivian sought me out specifically because of my expertise with head injuries of this nature." "How fascinating," Eleanor replied smoothly. "And what treatment do you propose?" Dr. Pemberton opened his medical bag and withdrew a small vial filled with clear liquid. "A new preparation from the continent. It stimulates the nervous system and can restore lost memories quite rapidly. However, it must be administered while the patient is in a relaxed state." Alexander felt his blood chill as he looked at the vial. Whatever was in that bottle, he was certain it wasn't medicine. The way Vivian's eyes fixed on it, with barely concealed eagerness, confirmed his worst suspicions. "What exactly is in this preparation?" Dr. Blackwood asked, his voice carrying professional skepticism. "A proprietary blend," the false doctor replied evasively. "The formula is quite complex, involving several alkaloids and other compounds. I'm afraid I cannot reveal the exact composition, as it represents years of research." Eleanor moved closer to examine the vial, her trained eye taking in every detail. "Might I ask where you obtained your medical training, Dr. Pemberton? Your approach seems quite unconventional." The man's composure slipped slightly. "I studied at several institutions across Europe. My methods may seem unusual to those trained in more traditional approaches." "Indeed," Eleanor said dryly. "And this treatment, have you used it successfully before?" "Many times," he replied, but Alexander noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he held the vial. "The results are quite remarkable. Complete restoration of memory within hours." Alexander made his decision. Whatever was in that bottle, he would not allow it to be administered. But he needed to expose Vivian's plan without revealing that he had been conscious during her previous visit. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice weak but determined, "but I don't feel ready for any treatments yet. My head still aches terribly, and I'm having trouble focusing. Perhaps we should wait until I'm stronger." Vivian's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing a flash of frustration before she composed herself. "But darling, Dr. Pemberton has come all this way. Surely it would be best to proceed while he's here." "I must agree with His Grace," Dr. Blackwood interjected firmly. "Any treatment should wait until we have a clearer picture of his condition. I'd like to conduct a thorough examination first." "That's quite unnecessary," the false doctor said quickly. "Lady Vivian has provided me with all the information I need. The treatment is perfectly safe, and delay could actually hinder his recovery." Eleanor stepped between the man and Alexander's bed, her stance protective. "Dr. Pemberton, I'm sure you understand that we cannot administer any treatment without proper documentation of its composition and effects. Perhaps you could provide us with your research notes?" "My notes are confidential," he replied, his accent becoming more pronounced under stress. "I cannot share proprietary information." "Then I'm afraid we cannot proceed," Dr. Blackwood said with finality. "As the attending physician, I must insist on knowing exactly what any treatment contains before it's given to my patient." Vivian's composure finally cracked completely. "This is ridiculous. Alexander needs this treatment. Dr. Pemberton is a respected specialist, and you're treating him like some sort of charlatan. Are we?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Dr. Pemberton, perhaps you could tell us which medical college you attended, or provide references from other physicians who can vouch for your work." The false doctor's face had gone pale, and Alexander could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. That is, my credentials are not in question here. Lady Vivian has engaged my services, and I am prepared to proceed with the treatment." "No," Alexander said, his voice growing stronger. "I will not consent to any treatment until I understand exactly what it involves, and I want a second opinion from another physician." Vivienne turned on him with sudden fury, her careful mask finally falling away completely. "Alexander, you're being unreasonable. This man can help you recover completely, and you're refusing based on the objections of these people who have no authority over your care." "These people," Alexander replied, his memory seeming to clear with each word, "are my family and friends, and I trust their judgment more than that of a stranger who refuses to explain his methods." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Margaret, who swept into the room with her usual commanding presence. She took in the scene with sharp eyes, the false doctor clutching his vial, Vivian's flushed face, Eleanor's protective stance, and Alexander sitting up in bed with growing clarity. "How delightful," Lady Margaret said with icy politeness. "Lady Vivian, I wasn't expecting you to return so soon, and who might this gentleman be?" "Dr. Pemberton," Vivian said through gritted teeth. "He's here to treat Alexander." "Is he indeed?" Lady Margaret's gaze fixed on the false doctor with laser intensity. "How curious. You see, I took the liberty of making inquiries about London physicians specializing in head injuries. There is no Dr. Pemberton practicing in that field. In fact, there is no Dr. Pemberton of any description who matches your distinctive appearance." The false doctor's composure collapsed entirely. He looked wildly around the room, clearly seeking an escape route, but found himself surrounded by hostile faces. "I think," Lady Margaret continued smoothly, "that we should examine the contents of that vial you're carrying. I'm quite curious to know what sort of medicine you intended to give my nephew." "That won't be necessary," the man said quickly, moving toward the door. "I can see that my services are not wanted here. Lady Vivian, perhaps we should discuss alternative arrangements." But Edmund had appeared in the doorway, blocking the exit. "I don't think anyone should be leaving just yet," he said pleasantly. "Not until we understand exactly what's been planned here." Vivienne looked around the room with growing desperation, finally understanding that her scheme had been completely exposed. "This is preposterous," she declared. "You're all acting as if there's some sort of conspiracy, when all I've done is try to help Alexander recover." "Have you?" Alexander asked, his voice now clear and strong. "Because I'm beginning to remember things, Vivienne. Fragments of conversations, voices I heard while I was unconscious, and what I remember doesn't suggest someone who wanted me to recover." The accusation hung in the air like a sword. Vivian's face went white, then flushed red as she realized the implications of his words. You were conscious," she whispered. "You heard everything," Alexander confirmed, rising from his bed with Eleanor's assistance. "Every word you spoke about wishing for my death, every plan you made with Harrington, every threat you whispered in my ear before you left." The false doctor chose that moment to make his escape attempt, pushing past Edmund and fleeing toward the stairs. But Lady Margaret had anticipated this, and her footmen were waiting in the hallway. Within moments he was captured and the vial secured. "I think," Lady Margaret announced with satisfaction, "that we should have this substance analyzed immediately. I suspect we'll find it contains something far more sinister than medicine." Vivienne stood frozen in the center of the room, her world collapsing around her. "Alexander, please, you must understand. I never meant for any real harm to come to you. I was desperate, trapped in an engagement I never wanted." "So you decided to murder me?" Alexander's voice was cold with fury. "That was your solution to an unwanted engagement?" "It wasn't murder," Vivian protested weakly. It would have looked like a complication from your injuries. No one would have suspected." Her words sealed her fate. In admitting her intent, she had confessed to attempted murder in front of multiple witnesses. "I think," Dr. Blackwood said quietly, "that we should summon the magistrate. This matter is beyond our ability to handle privately." As the reality of her situation sank in, Vivian's composure shattered completely. She sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands, sobbing with what might have been genuine remorse or simply fear of the consequences. Alexander looked around the room at the people who had saved his life, his aunt's fierce loyalty, his cousin's devotion, Dr. Blackwood's friendship, and Eleanor's courage and quick thinking. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly free to choose his own path. "Miss Hartwell," he said, turning to Eleanor with a smile that transformed his entire face, "I believe I owe you a debt I can never repay. You've given me back not just my life, but my freedom to live it as I choose." Eleanor's answering smile was radiant. "Your Grace, I think you'll find that freedom is something you give yourself. I simply helped you recognize that you already possessed it." As the magistrate was summoned and Vivienne was led away to face the consequences of her actions, Alexander felt the weight of obligation and duty lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he was free to discover what it meant to choose love over duty, authenticity over appearance, and truth over convenience. The golden cage had been opened, and Alexander Whitmore was finally free to fly. But what new challenges would freedom bring? And could a man who had lived his entire life bound by duty learn to navigate a world where his heart, rather than his obligations, would guide his choices? 6 months had passed since the dramatic events at Thornfield Manor, and the English countryside had transformed from the stark beauty of winter into the lush promise of early summer. Alexander stood in the gardens of Hartwell House, a modest but elegant estate in the Cotswolds that had belonged to Eleanor's family for generations. The property was smaller than Thornfield, but it possessed a warmth and authenticity that the grand ducal seat had always lacked. The scandal of Vivian's arrest and trial had rocked London society to its foundations. The revelation that Lady Vivian Ashford had attempted to poison a duke, her own fiancé, with the help of a charlatan posing as a physician, had dominated the newspapers for weeks. The substance in the vial had been analyzed and found to contain a lethal combination of digitalis and arsenic, carefully calculated to mimic the effects of a brain hemorrhage. Vivian was now serving a sentence of 20 years transportation to Australia, while her accomplice had been sentenced to hang. The Pemberton family had been utterly ruined by the scandal. The Earl had been forced to sell his estates to pay his debts, and the family name had become synonymous with treachery and greed. Lord Harrington, faced with the exposure of his role in the conspiracy, had fled to the continent and had not been heard from since. But for Alexander, the months following Vivian's downfall had been a time of profound transformation and unexpected joy. He had discovered that freedom from obligation allowed him to see the world and himself with new eyes. "Alexander," Eleanor's voice called from the terrace where she was arranging flowers in a simple ceramic vase. "Dr. Morrison will be arriving soon for his consultation. Are you ready?" Alexander smiled as he watched her work. Eleanor had insisted on maintaining her medical practice even after their engagement, establishing a small clinic on the estate where she treated local families and continued her work with veterans suffering from war injuries. Her dedication to healing had only deepened Alexander's admiration for her character. "As ready as one can be for such a conversation," Alexander replied, joining her on the terrace. "Though I confess, I never imagined I would be discussing the establishment of a hospital for wounded soldiers with such enthusiasm." Eleanor looked up from her flowers, her dark eyes sparkling with the intelligence and compassion that had first drawn him to her. "You've changed considerably from the man who thought duty meant accepting whatever path others laid out for him." "I had an excellent teacher," Alexander said, taking her hands in his. The simple gold band on her finger caught the afternoon sunlight. They had married quietly 3 months earlier, in a ceremony that emphasized love over spectacle. You showed me that true duty lies in using one's advantages to help others, not simply in maintaining tradition. Their wedding had been a revelation in itself. Instead of the grand cathedral ceremony that had been planned with Vivienne, Alexander and Eleanor had exchanged vows in the small village church near Hartwell House. The guest list had included tenant farmers, local physicians, wounded soldiers Eleanor had treated, and a handful of family members who understood that this union represented something far more meaningful than a merger of fortunes. Lady Margaret had been particularly pleased with the match. "Finally," she had declared at the wedding breakfast, "a Whitmore who has chosen a partner worthy of the name rather than simply suitable for the title." The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Dr. James Morrison, a distinguished physician from Edinburgh who had gained renown for his innovative treatments of battlefield injuries. Alexander had invited him to Hartwell House to discuss a project that had become his passion, the establishment of a comprehensive medical facility for veterans returning from Britain's various military campaigns. Dr. Morrison was a man in his 50s, with greying hair and the steady hands of someone who had performed countless surgeries under difficult conditions. He greeted Alexander and Eleanor with the respectful warmth of a professional colleague rather than the deference typically shown to a duke. "Your Grace, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, using Eleanor's preferred form of address. "I must say, your proposal has generated considerable excitement in medical circles. The idea of a facility that combines physical treatment with psychological care is revolutionary. The credit belongs entirely to my wife," Alexander replied, his pride in Eleanor evident. She recognized that many veterans suffer from wounds that cannot be seen, injuries to the mind and spirit that are as debilitating as any physical trauma. Eleanor blushed slightly at the praise, but maintained her professional composure. "Dr. Morrison, I've prepared detailed plans for your review. The facility would include not just medical treatment rooms, but workshops where patients could learn new trades, gardens for therapeutic cultivation, and living quarters for those who need extended care." As they toured the proposed site, a section of the Hartwell estate that offered both privacy and accessibility, Dr. Morrison's enthusiasm grew visibly. "The location is ideal," he observed. "Close enough to London for consultation with specialists, but rural enough to provide the peace necessary for healing. We've also secured commitments from several other physicians," Eleanor added. "Dr. Blackwood will oversee general medical care, and we have specialists in surgery, neurology, and what the Germans are calling psychiatry, the treatment of mental distress." Alexander watched Eleanor explain her vision with growing admiration. In the months since their marriage, he had seen her transform from a dedicated but solitary healer into a leader capable of inspiring others to join her cause. Her work had given his wealth and position a purpose he had never imagined possible. "The funding?" Dr. Morrison inquired practically. "Fully secured," Alexander replied. "I've liquidated several investments and redirected the income from 2 of my estates. The facility will be entirely self-sustaining within 5 years. Nasiti, what Alexander didn't mention was the personal satisfaction he derived from using his inherited wealth for something meaningful. For too long, the Whitmore fortune had been simply a tool for maintaining social position. Now it would serve to heal those who had sacrificed for their country. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Edmund rode up the drive with obvious excitement, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Alexander! Eleanor! You must hear this news immediately," he called out, his face flushed with exertion and enthusiasm. "Edmund, what's happened?" Alexander asked, noting his cousin's unusual agitation. "It's about Vivienne," Edmund announced breathlessly. "She's dead." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Despite everything Vivienne had done, despite her attempts to murder him, He felt a complex mixture of emotions at the news of her death. "How?" Eleanor asked quietly, her medical training making her focus on practical details. "Fever, according to the reports from the penal colony," Edmund explained. "She survived less than 4 months in Australia. The conditions there are harsh, particularly for someone of her background." Alexander felt Eleanor's hand slip into his, offering silent support as he processed this information. "I should feel relief," he said slowly. "She tried to kill me after all, but instead I feel sadness. Sadness for the waste of a life, for the choices that led her to such desperation." "That speaks well of your character," Dr. Morrison observed. "The ability to feel compassion, even for those who have wronged us, is the mark of a truly civilized man." Eleanor squeezed Alexander's hand gently. "Vivienne made her choices, Alexander. You cannot blame yourself for the consequences of her actions." "I know," Alexander replied. "But I can't help wondering if things might have been different, if our society didn't trap people in roles they never chose. If she had been free to follow her own path from the beginning, she would still have been capable of murder." Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. "Alexander, many people face unwanted obligations without resorting to violence. Vivienne's choices were her own." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we might continue our discussion inside. I believe there are practical matters to address regarding the hospital." As they moved into the house, Alexander reflected on how different his life had become. 6 months ago, he had been trapped in an engagement to a woman who wished for his death, bound by obligations he had never questioned. Now he was married to a woman who challenged him to be better than he had ever imagined possible, using his position and wealth to create something meaningful. The afternoon was spent in detailed planning for the medical facility. Dr. Morrison's expertise, combined with Eleanor's vision and Alexander's resources, created a synergy that promised to revolutionize the treatment of military veterans. By evening, they had established timelines, staffing requirements, and treatment protocols that would serve as a model for similar facilities throughout the empire. "I must say," Dr. Morrison remarked as they concluded their discussions, "this project represents exactly the kind of innovation our profession needs. Too often, we treat symptoms without addressing underlying causes. Your approach recognizes that healing involves the whole person, not just the immediate injury." After Dr. Morrison's departure, Alexander and Eleanor walked through their gardens as the sun set over the Cotswolds. The evening air was warm and fragrant, with the scent of roses and lavender, and Alexander felt a contentment he had never experienced during his years at Thornfield. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked, as they paused beside a fountain that had been built by her grandfather. "Giving up the grand life of a duke for this quieter existence?" Alexander considered the question seriously. "I haven't given up being a duke," he replied. "I've simply redefined what that means. Instead of using my title to maintain social position, I'm using it to create positive change. Instead of marrying for obligation, I'm married for love. Instead of preserving tradition for its own sake, I'm building something new and meaningful." Eleanor smiled, her face radiant in the golden light of sunset. "And what about children? Do you think our future sons and daughters will understand the choices we've made?" The question of children was one they had discussed frequently. Alexander wanted his future heirs to understand that privilege came with responsibility, that wealth was a tool for service rather than simply comfort. "I hope," Alexander said thoughtfully, "that we can raise children who see their advantages as opportunities to help others, rather than simply to maintain their own position. Children who choose their own paths based on their values, rather than society's expectations." "And if they choose paths we don't expect?" Eleanor challenged playfully. "What if our daughter wants to be a physician, or our son wants to be an artist?" "Then we'll support them completely," Alexander replied without hesitation. "I've learned that happiness comes from following one's authentic calling, not from meeting others' expectations." As they continued their evening walk, Alexander reflected on the lessons of the past months. He had learned that true strength came not from accepting whatever fate others designed, but from having the courage to choose one's own destiny. He had discovered that love, based on mutual respect and shared values, was infinitely more satisfying than any arrangement based on social convenience. Most importantly, he had learned that his position and wealth were not burdens to be endured, but tools to be used for the betterment of others. "Eleanor," he said as they reached the terrace where they had begun their walk, "I want you to know that you've given me something I never thought possible. A life of purpose and meaning. You've shown me that duty and happiness need not be mutually exclusive." Eleanor's response was to rise on her toes and kiss him gently, a gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. "Alexander, you've given me something equally precious, the freedom to pursue my calling, with the support and resources to make a real difference. Together, we're creating something neither of us could have achieved alone." As they stood together in the gathering twilight, Alexander felt a profound sense of gratitude for the events that had brought them together. Vivian's betrayal, painful as it had been, had freed him from a life of obligation and opened the door to authentic happiness. Her death, tragic though it was, served as a final reminder of the destructive power of choices made from desperation rather than principle. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities they would choose together. The hospital would be built, veterans would be healed, and their own children would grow up understanding that true nobility came not from inherited titles, but from the courage to use one's advantages in service of others. Alexander Whitmore had finally learned to bloom where he was planted, not in the gilded cage of social expectation, but in the rich soil of authentic love and meaningful purpose. And in that blooming, he had discovered that freedom was not something to be granted by others, but something to be claimed by the courage of one's own choices. The Duke, who had once accepted whatever path others laid out for him, had become a man who charted his own course, guided by love, principle, and the unwavering support of a woman who had shown him that the greatest adventures were those chosen from the heart. In the end, Alexander realized the most profound transformation was not in his circumstances, but in his understanding of what it meant to live an authentic life. And that understanding, hard won through deception and betrayal, had led him to a happiness more genuine than any he could have imagined in his former existence. The golden cage had been not just opened, but transformed into a garden where love could flourish and purpose could take root. And in that garden, Alexander and Eleanor would build a legacy far more meaningful than any that could be inherited. A legacy of healing, service, and the courage to choose love over obligation, authenticity over appearance, and hope over fear. If this story of transformation and true love has moved you, I'd be honored if you would subscribe to hear more tales of courage, redemption, and the power of authentic choice. Share in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between obligation and your heart's true calling? Your stories of courage inspire others to find their own path to freedom and authentic happiness.